Hello, folks. This is Michael with the Reason RX podcast, and my co host,
Melanie.
or should I say, I'm the co host, Michael, with the host,
Sure.
Melanie. So, today we're going to be doing What is Education Part 2 with award winning teacher Scott Harris. He's back again. So, we'll be talking about what is education, why we even need education, what subjects should be in education, and what methods we should use. And then after that, or in the course of that, we'll look at education, what education is versus like adult education or training and some other similar concepts like that, make some contrasts. But as a reminder, your co-host Melanie is piano teacher in Minneapolis. She if you want to learn any of 30 or 40 instruments and have your child have a good chances of winning the Minnesota State Championship, then Melanie is someone you should contact. Which instruments again, Melanie?
Piano, flute, clarinet, saxophone, a few others, not as much, but those four mainly. And a lot of theory, a lot of music theory, which is kind of its own little sort of interesting way to look at music.
Yeah.
But yeah, mostly those instruments.
And remember, folks, if you're in homeschooling or if you're a parent who wants to do extra work in the summer or after school for your kids, you can contact any one of us or all three for help with homeschooling, teaching methods, curriculum design, or if anybody out there wants, like a teacher wants some training on how to teach better or help their school, then you can contact any one of us or all three of us. We all do work on that and some consulting. So we'll go ahead and start, first of all, reviewing from last time. We talked about what is education. What are some things, guys, y'all want to review from last time that we discussed for the audience? Put you on the spot. Okay, so last time we talked about what education is, and we defined it. One definition, remember, is primary education, not adult education or some other things, but the basic concept is systematic training of the conceptual faculty of the young in order to prepare them in both form and content, method and ideas for adult life. They need to, like all animals, people need to learn the skills they need for adult life. That's what education should essentially be. Not jumping through hoops, not memorizing stuff, not learning to obey, but learning to be an independent member of the tribe, so to speak. We're social animals, we work in groups, but we need to be able to stand on our own and support our own weight. We need to be, as some ancient peoples were, sometimes, like in some places, the males would have to go out alone for a week or two and show they could survive. But they got to show they can survive and they can help other people. They can support themselves and support the tribe. So, that kind of thing. Go ahead, Scott.
One way to think of that as a teacher from a curriculum perspective is that late middle school and early high school should be kind of like an equilateral triangle in which the base of the pyramid, the most amount of time is spent on skill development and not on just endless content. That would be the top of the pyramid. But as you go through high school, then that pyramid kind of flips itself. You should have most of the skills down. And now that you have those skills, it's time to layer in more content with which you can then play around with and do, analysis and more interesting things.
Yeah, that's good, and we'll be getting into that more in the what is education. We can, wasn't it Piaget who, him and some others formulated kind of some basic stages that all people go through when they're learning, basically memorizing and sensorial, and then primitive operations or something, and then formal operations. Do you remember, Scott?
Right, concrete, right. Pre-operational, concrete operations. And so abstract thinking, you really don't see kids being able to do it well until age 7 to 11. They start to pick that up. Earlier on, it's object permanence. You cover the toy with a blanket and the little kid thinks that the toy is gone, right? And you pull the blanket and they're surprised that it's there. As the kid gets a little bit older, if you hide the toy behind your back, they grab your arm because they know that the toy is there. So they've established permanence. The famous experiment that Piaget did is called conservation, in which you put 2 beakers with equal amount of water, poured one of the beakers into a graduated cylinder, which is much taller but skinnier, and then asking the kids, do they have the same amount or does one have more? And the kids will say that one has more because, taller means bigger. And so they have not yet developed the ability to conserve or keep constant that relationship, the volume of water. They're just looking at the height.
Yeah, it's interesting.
And I filmed my kids doing that experiment when he was 5, and then at age 7 later, he was able to get it.
Interesting.
So that's a fun thing to show in class.
Cool. Nice. But anything else from last time? I mean, Piaget is new this time, but anything from last time you remember we talked about we could review? I think we talked a little about, as we did the first episode with Scott, some about definition, about integration and induction. We can bring those up a lot more when we're talking about methods and goals. But I
was thinking, in case someone's just joining in, this might be their first time, maybe Scott could talk about what he teaches and what he's doing right now in schools or wherever you're at.
I teach AP Psychology, AP Macroeconomics, and Philosophy. So it's a pretty full schedule. I've also taught World and U.S. History, Theory of Knowledge, and coached swimming and water polo for 17 years.
That's
fantastic. How long was your bicycle ride today?
Yes. Did 20 miles today, and I'm going to ride with the fast people tomorrow, so we'll see how I hold up on the 40 to 50 mile ride.
Cool. Yeah, tomorrow I'm not going to get as much exercise as usual because I got to fill in for a friend at the local farmer's market, selling meat for him. So then didn't do much today because 26 April 2019, today is day 1 of the iNaturalist City Nature Challenge, I think they call it. So I was out this morning for 2.5 hours taking pictures of plants and animals and posting them on iNaturalist until my phone died. And then I went out this afternoon for another 2 or 3 hours and posted pictures of eastern carpenter bees and plants and some other things until my phone died. So representing Houston.
That's great.
So as I sent Melanie, temporarily I'm number 2 in Houston for observations and I think species too. But that won't last because last year there were a few people who had over 1,000 observations, and in that over like 500 species.
That's a lot of time outdoors.
Yeah. If I didn't have to work Saturday and Sunday, maybe I could get close, but no way it's going to happen because we have only till the 29th.
Oh, okay. 3 more days.
Yeah. But that was fun. All right. So I forgot some of what we talked about last time too, but it's a reason to listen to the podcast, folks. It's worth it. So first of all, we've gone over a little bit about what is education. And then we got material in the podcast from last time. Now, one important thing we need to talk about, something that doesn't really seem to come up a lot, is seriously, it just comes up as like a plaint on the part of some people or some kids. Why do we need this? But an important thing is, why do we need education? Is a serious question. So, what do you think, Scott?
Why do we need jumping jacks? We do those in gym class and nobody ever questions it.
Yeah.
And I tell them, you never do jumping jacks again. Why do we do them? No job interview ends with, let me see 10 of your best jumping jacks.
Yeah.
No, I think they should. That would be great.
Or what do you do? I don't ever see a guy in a bar trying to pick up a girl. Look at my jumping jacks.
Yeah. And a lot of adults don't even lift their arms over their head the whole day, other than maybe to put on a t-shirt. So a jumping jack gets your body moving in lots of different directions. It gets your heart rate going, and so it warms you up for whatever it is you're about to do, tennis or whatever. So similarly, school makes you take a lot of different subjects because it's trying to stretch your brain in a lot of different directions. And each subject has different methodologies, different epistemologies, and you're going to be a better thinker in whatever it is that you do and become for having taken chemistry, right? For having taken art, etc. And I usually talk about this on the first day of school because, I ask them, why are you here? Why'd you get up this morning? And, they look at you like, what do you mean? There's a law. And I'm like, really? A law? That's why you came. And if it wasn't mandatory attendance, you wouldn't come. But I tell the traditional way to sell kids on this is to tell them you're going to be using chemistry the rest of your life. And I tell them it's a lie. I haven't used chemistry since high school. I mean, I know about, I balance the pH in my pool, but, short of that, I don't use it much. I'm better for having taken it. And so one thing I try to get them to understand is quit trying to say what's the immediate utility of this subject. And try and, to the extent that you can, fall in love with the subject a little bit and understand what it can bring you. And teaching macroeconomics, it's not something that people generally fall in love with on their own. But about the third of the way through the course, a lot of kids will start to say, oh, I can really see how this is useful and how this is kind of cool. But it takes a little bit of struggle first.
Yeah, and there's going to be a lot that you cannot deal with as an adult unless you know the chemistry. There's a lot I do in basic survival and living that involves a knowledge of chemistry. I want to figure out how the body works. I don't like the sense body because it sounds so inanimate and impersonal. I'd like to think better, just like, how does my animal work? I'm a living biological organism, not a body like a rock or something. When a body, what is that? I'm an animal, like a living, breathing, feeling thing with like passions and feelings and emotions and thoughts, but I couldn't understand a lot of things: health, nutrition, getting rid of autism, how the brain works, what we should eat, what's in the world around us, unless I knew chemistry. And so part of the thing is, what I like to tell students, I like to turn things around. Sometimes, and it's a well-known thing, it's like a cliche. People say, when are we ever going to use this? As a plaint, or as if they have an argument. When are we ever going to use this? And I turn around and say, exactly, right. When are you ever going to use this? In other words, when are you going to be engaged and passionate about the world and dig into it independently and think about things you love and use this valuable knowledge? Why are you going to not use it at all? I mean, don't expect to be led around on a leash like a dog or something, or pulled, engage, get this stuff and use it.
And you don't know what your future holds. You don't know what direction you're going to go into. I think I mentioned this in a previous podcast, that when I was coaching, I used to read a lot of marketing books, because marketing is about selling people on things. And that's a lot of what coaching is. And then later on, when I became a consultant, there was a ready body of knowledge that I was glad that I had.
Yeah. And then as adults, there's a lot we have to be prepared to do immediately. You're switching roles, so to speak. And really, the more philosophical way to put that is you're just switching perspectives on the same thing. Aristotle, I think, identified the concept of focus, that we can have selective focus. We can look at something in a certain way because of the nature of our consciousness and reason, whereas some animals can't. I don't know to what extent some can and some can't. That still has to be investigated, but we can look at things in different ways, and so we have to look at your children as a parent, switch perspective, and think about the chemical aspect of their diet or themselves, and think about the social aspect. And so the different subjects always come into play. There's some physics involved in playing and working out, and chemistry involved in diet, and how certain things are going to affect the kids, and you have to deal with people, and you have to deal with people and physics at the same time. There's all this integration of knowledge going on. So, we got to, and you got to buy cars and buy houses and do all this mathy stuff. And, not everybody has to know everything, but we should try to be the best we can be to live the best life we can and make decisions more independently. Because, as Scott said, we don't know what's going to happen. And the world is complex and has all these different facets to it we need to be prepared to deal with, and not come out blind, like coming across a chasm with no bridge and having no way to get over, and maybe slipping and falling and dying. We need to be ready for it.
And I would say that one of the ways to get kids in love with the subject, of course, is to fall in love with it yourself. We've all had a past teacher versus one who wasn't, and it's just a completely different experience. But that's part of that passion comes from the fact that realizing that doing something is an end in itself. And this is one of the 4 classic goals of a liberal arts education, that you're going to have a fuller, richer life because of this. And immediately students will, well, what about I get a job? We'll get to that later. Right now, this novel is really amazing. And with any good book, you come out a different person on the end of it than you were going in. I tell them the story of Robert Oppenheimer, who worked on the Manhattan Project, the atomic bomb. And he, of course, was terribly conflicted about this, creating this thing that could do so much damage. but he taught himself Sanskrit, as
Wow.
one does. And he was also a fan of poetry. And there's this poem called Trinity by John Donne, and it has this line, "I am destroyer of worlds." And it goes on to talk about how sometimes things have to be destroyed to be rebuilt. And so he named the test bomb that they blew up Trinity. So here is a very strong scientist who is informed by poetry, and he's a better scientist because of it.
Yeah, and a mathematician people don't hear a lot about, Carl Friedrich Gauss, because he was later in history in the 1700s, so his work was way more advanced, so people get to it a little bit in high school, more in college, or maybe never because it's so abstract and complicated and sophisticated. But he did some work that's involved in linear regression and other regressions. But when he was 16, 18, I don't know, he was torn as to what he wanted to major in college and do for his life. He didn't know. He had two loves. He loved language and he loved math. And then once he solved, like at 16 or whatever, the fundamental theorem of algebra, then he went into math. But all through his life, he'd read newspapers from around the world every morning, and so students called him the paper tiger because I heard he'd stand over someone and stare at them until they gave up the newspaper. And he kept learning new languages, so even when he was in his maybe 40s, he took up Russian, and after studying it for a few years, people from Russia did not believe him when he said he was born like in Germany. They said, "No, you're from Russia. You have to be the way you talk." And then he was put in charge of a university's finances at one point, and he learned so much about finance, and then he invested in railroads, so when he died, he left behind a minor fortune. Mm-hmm. And he was good at physics. He was an early inventor of the telegraph, and he has some inventions to his name in surveying.
And that's to your point you made earlier about engaging with the subject, that these subjects have things to deliver, but you have to engage first. They don't always give up their secrets easily, but doing so makes the world around you come alive. It allows you to connect with previous generations. I like these universities that will sometimes have the freshman class through the English department all read the same novel. And so here's the whole, 1,500 per whatever freshman class having a common intellectual experience and talking about it in the dormitories. And
yeah, and like to add to that, what you said, I think when you engage with the world will engage with you.
Yes.
If you don't engage, it's not engaged. It's a mutual thing. And then, man, there's another point I should have written down. Something I was going to say and I forgot. But anyway, we got plenty to say. But, so that, and then, one thing that is relevant here too, Melanie's heard this. I don't know if you've heard this, Scott. This is interesting, but Abraham Lincoln was a lot more multifaceted and developed than a lot of people I think know. A lot of people know he was president. Some know he was a lawyer. Okay, so he must be, by people's conventional thought or prejudice nowadays, he must be just some thin, weak guy, some nerd. But Abraham Lincoln, no, when he grew up, he had like third grade education. He was homeschooled. Maybe he got to third grade or something, and then he was learning on his own, and he studied surveying and became a surveyor, and then he became a lawyer. And the guy could build, and he was well-rounded. He was optimal in fitness and optimal in cognition. So there are stories where I don't know how the axes were then versus now, but I guess the axes then were a lot heavier, but he could hold an axe perpendicular to his body straight out without bending his arm or anything, with a good solid grip. Like one time he went to some town and he was new there, and so he got challenged to run the fastest racer in one county, box, I think it was the best boxer in another county, and wrestle the best wrestler in another county. So he had to run, box, maybe wrestle, and he beat them all. Or one time he came to some town and he got challenged to a fight. And, they don't have radio or TV, and this is part of their entertainment. So, okay, at the end of the day, everyone's going to go gather around and bet and talk and socialize and drink and watch this fight and whatever else. And this is no holds barred. It's not like nowadays where you got certain rules and a referee separating you. This is anything. Anything goes. So Abraham Lincoln, as a little 25-year-old or whatever, is going at it with this other guy, and he knocks him down and wins. And then he says, anybody else want to take me down? Or anybody else want to fight? You want to fight? You want to fight? You want to fight? No? Yeah. I'm the buck around here. And he's actually, people can look it up, he's in the, wrestling, like National Wrestling Hall of Fame or Boxing Hall of Fame. Because he was, the records aren't like sure and clear for the time, but I think he was undefeated in all his fights. And then when he was in his 40s and he was struggling as a lawyer, he didn't know what to do, and he was a wise guy. He's smart, Instead of going to lawyer school or doing surveying on the side or going into a new profession, the one thing he decided to do to make himself better, to support his family, was to study Euclid's Elements on his own after the court cases. They had the circuit they'd go around, the lawyers and the judges, and then while the others were smoking their pipes and talking, he was off in the corner memorizing Euclid's Elements. And remember, that's like 3 volumes. You've seen that, right, Scott?
Yes.
Original Euclid's Elements, not like what people learn in school now. He memorized that, and people can see it's actually in his speeches. He'll talk about reasoning according to the methods of Euclid. He says it explicitly, and he talks about adducing facts, using logic, proving things, like in the Lincoln-Douglas debates that are famous and that we know about, but I don't think are taught about anymore. But, and so that allowed him to become successful as a lawyer, become a senator, become president. So our country is the way it is because he studied Euclid's Elements on his own. And that's exactly what you're saying, Scott, what we're all saying. So I think that's an awesome, beautiful story. Abraham Lincoln is like so well-rounded and
and I think that segues, the first goal I said was as an end in itself. The second goal is shaping character, style, and taste of a person. And certainly through reading those kinds of things and those kinds of experiences, he's developing his character, learning what's good for you versus what is truly good for you. Lots of things seem to be good at the time, but as you get older and wiser, right, that starts to emerge.
Or
And
like,
then
really quickly, like did you see The Magnificent Seven?
I think I've seen that.
There's a
Which one?
story in there I remember. It's based on the Seven Samurai, but
Right.
one of the characters in The Magnificent Seven says to someone else, "Yeah, one time I knew some guy that jumped into a cactus." Why did he jump into a cactus? Because he thought it was a good idea at the time.
And that's what a lot of teenage excuses begin with, is it seemed like a good idea at the time.
Yeah,
And
unfortunately.
so being able to foresee some of those consequences, that comes from education. Nietzsche has that great line, to give style to your character. Who are you? What are you going to become? It's not, actively engage in this stuff and think about who you want to be and how you want to present yourself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like style to your character. That's good. Like what? Think about what clothes you wear, but what values do you want to possess and express, and how do you want to engage with people in the world?
And so now that's heading toward what kind of an employee are you going to be, since they're always worried about what am I going to do for a living. Giving style to your character, if everybody at your job has the same credentials, how do you differentiate yourself?
Mm-hmm.
Are you the guy who's always on time? Are you the guy that delivers a joke for a moment of levity? Are you the guy that, makes sure the boss is prepared? There's so many different ways to give style to your character.
Yeah, and then with stories. Okay, wait. First, before we continue about that kind of thing, character and morality, I want to say before I forget, when I'm talking about Abraham Lincoln, I'm not advocating fighting. I'm not saying we should go out and beat other people up, or you're going to be better if you beat other people up. Let's go out and beat people up and we'll be better. I'm just saying that's one thing that shows Abraham Lincoln's physical prowess. That's like the way things were at the time. When after they fight, I'm sure they were probably like still good friends. So I just want to make that clear. I'm just advocating being your best physically and having physical prowess and doing it in a good way. Okay.
You can challenge them in tennis.
Yeah. Or a bicycle race or MoveNat.
Yeah.
So Scott, question for you. In your experience with students, that you're talking about, what's your style and what's your character going to be as you're growing up and stuff. I think that, would you agree that students look outward to find influence or some sort of inspiration from people? And it seems like there's sort of a lack of good inspiration or good influences out there, good role models I'm wondering, where do you see the students getting their ideas from? If they're not reading good literature, they're not seeing good movies, and the anti-hero is a big thing now, in the culture, and I'm just curious what you think of that.
Wow, that's a big question. Certainly they're going to look up to sports stars or pop stars or celebrity, and a lot of parents worry about that, but we often did as children. I don't think that teenagers are superficial as people sometimes think. They recognize that stuff it's a lot of illusion and image and so on. And they do engage. They are inspired by Martin Luther King. They are inspired by good books that they read. So I think they do a decent job of pulling from diverse sources on that.
But you think teachers and parents could be more active or whatever about finding good people in history or nowadays to show their kids certain points and to like bring them into the kids' lives so they're aware of certain things they wouldn't otherwise be aware of?
Sure. I have a folder of ethical examples that when we cover ethics in philosophy, and a lot of them are from sports and its dilemmas where a rule was broken or had to be broken, and kids forfeiting. Who was the famous female golf player, Babe Didrikson? Was that her last name? And she signed her golf card and she penalized herself a stroke, and somebody commented, well, nobody would have known. And she said, I would have known.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there are a lot of great heroic sports stories because sports demand heroic action to get good at it.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have examples from the world of entrepreneurship. So I think there's a lot of different areas to draw from.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then if we study more history, there's a lot more there than we've actually learned. Like just as we've taken history in school, doesn't mean we know the totality of the field. It's good to read a lot, learn about people, like I've only learned about that stuff about Abraham Lincoln in the past, like some of it a few years ago and some of it 10 or 15. Some other people like that also I've only learned about more recently, but I like to bring it up when I'm tutoring students.
Well, another thing, a great line by Oscar Wilde, and he wrote this in a letter to a friend of his, is he said, I fear you never developed the Oxford habit, by which I mean the ability to play gracefully with ideas. And that's something I want my students to be able to do, for that to be part of their character, is instead of this world where everybody's yelling at each other and you can't talk about topics around certain people, that we should be able to talk and we should be able to treat each other civilly and play gracefully with ideas. It's a great habit to have.
And Aristotle said something similar to that. Correct me, Scott, but it was something like the mark of an educated mind is being able to entertain ideas you disagree with. Do you remember what it was more exactly?
Yes, to entertain contradictory ideas. Yeah, and he did say that first. It often gets quoted to Mark Twain or whoever else, but to be able to hold an idea in your head, you don't have to accept it. We're just playing around with this idea.
Mm-hmm.
I sometimes use the phrase that this class is a jungle gym for your mind. We're just trying things out. What you accept. In philosophy, we cover arguments for the existence of God. And this semester, I had a girl who said, we're very Catholic and we're not allowed to question that. I said, well, you're not questioning that. We are analyzing, are these arguments reasonable supports for belief? That's independent of your belief.
Mm-hmm.
So you can maintain your belief. We're just looking at these four classic arguments, and do you find them to be good supports?
Mm-hmm. And then to segue off the thing you were saying about why students need to study some subjects, we're talking about getting you mentioned job interviews, getting a job, talking about character development, things like that. The students are focused on maybe skills too much. Skills are important, but don't a lot of people say the number one thing they look for in someone they're hiring is integrity?
That would be a good thing to have. And so that's the third classic goal. First, an end in itself. Second, shaping character, style, and taste. Third, to prepare for a useful career. Of course, they all want to do that. What then is a useful career? Not just any college degree will do, I would argue.
Mm-hmm.
I love all fields of learning. They're fascinating, but some of them pay particularly badly. And I've actually got an economist and a political scientist coming to my school on Monday to do a 4 or 5 hour talk with my kids. And the last thing they do is show some slides on what different fields pay. And it is eye-opening. So we'll let the cat out of the bag. The fields that pay the highest, of course, are engineering, of all kinds of engineering, and economics degrees are over there with the engineering degrees. And then as you come across on the far other end of lowest paid, basically anything that ends in studies, gender studies, any kind of studies. Unless you're going to get a PhD and become a professor in that field, it doesn't pay particularly well. Sociology is notoriously low paying. So they're fascinating and wonderful fields full of wonderful people, but you have to be looking at what kind of lifestyle do you want to live, and how is that going to be paid for?
Yeah, and that's where studying philosophy comes into play and why it's important. And the other things you mentioned, the other goals are relevant. It's not just money we need to think about. Some people think too much about that, but what's going to make you happy and be successful in life financially? Financial is only one part. We need to think more fully about what's going to make you an optimal human being and allow you to be the best you can, have physical and mental prowess, is like Abraham Lincoln.
And many, as you're saying right there, many entry-level jobs have the same skill set. So how do you differentiate yourself? Is it integrity? Is it you can bring in stuff from philosophy and other fields, right? As we're seeing in the tech world, they're increasingly hiring philosophers and liberal arts majors to deal with some of these really complex ethical questions.
Yeah. And then people need to think about more generally what kind of culture they want to live in. So for me, I say, not just because of what kind of culture we want to live in, but for other reasons, college is overrated. Way too many people go. Not as many people should go as do. It's for some people, definitely. I needed it because of where I was in life, and I think I was autistic, just the way my autism was expressing, not like it'd be for other people, but for me, I had to do something like that. But more people need to, and the culture needs to change to really appreciate plumbers, farmers, AC technicians, car mechanics. My car mechanic is having trouble finding someone to replace someone who's leaving. Car mechanics, they do problem solving. They help people get on the road. I find mine important because, like, for example, they fixed my car so I could go and be sure that it was going to function while I went to my grandmother's 100th birthday party. So, they do things that really help us get to work and drive people we care about who are hurt to the emergency room or hospital or whatever. It's not just repairing cars, it's helping people move to do the things they need at work or health or whatever. And it's a lot of problem solving. A lot of them get paid really well.
And that's the line. That's the line we use in economics, is creating value for other people.
Mm-hmm.
That's how you get paid.
Yeah.
It's not that you think your job is important, right? I'm a teacher. Oh, we're underpaid. Are you creating value for other people? Plumbers create value in a major way.
Yeah.
And they get paid for it. This is one way that society shows respect for professions, is that they pay you well for the value you create.
Yeah.
And so I tell them to start thinking that way now. As a minimum wage employee, how can you create value for your boss or the customer? And it's that mindset that you develop that they're going to pay you the big bucks for later.
Mm-hmm.
So no, you're not going to get the big bucks at 17, but you keep working on that mindset of creating value for other people. And then how scarce are your skills? Minimum wage jobs don't pay well because they're very easy to replace you with. Whereas Oppenheimer, right, a nuclear engineer, there's only so many of those around.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we got to be thinking of other things. And some people play down on the money too much. It's not everything, but it's not nothing. I think that's like two false choices. I don't care about the money, or all I care about is the money. It should be an integrated decision of culture, the world you want to live in, what makes you happy, eating, paying rent, paying bills, having savings, going on vacations, for which you need money. And so, an education should prepare someone for the future. And that's one reason why we have it. But then, on another level, philosophically, or a deeper level of causality, we need an education. Why do we have one? Because the conceptual faculty is volitional. That's where we have free will. We've got to train ourselves to think well. And it's like movement and perception, as Gibson talked about, I think it was him, he had a ecological view of perception. James Gibson, wasn't it him? Studied airplane pilots, if I remember the name right. I'll look it up really quickly. But that's one thing people are learning, and people can see that on some TED talks. Like the way they'll put it is mind is for movement. Mind or movement and perception are like integrally related, and that's what if it was Gibson, if I'm remembering right, that's one thing he said. That you can't understand vision apart from James J. Gibson, ecological psychology. You can't understand perception by have someone sitting in a chair and looking at things. Perception occurs as you're moving through your environment. And so that's wrapped up together. But in some things we do, like reason, like we need to really think things through before we act properly. And conceptually, and so we got to train our conceptual faculty to know how to form concepts correctly, how to be logical, how to form a correct induction, what are the rules, even in movement. Like, I didn't really know how to move well until more recently when I studied MoveNat. At first you're just doing stuff, whatever. Okay, you're kind of like doing stuff, but it's not efficient and biomechanically correct. So even that, because of the nature of our consciousness and how, that's in the culture we live in. I think if we lived in a better culture, we'd have better movement practices just from growing up and having movement role models and having to move through our environment well. Like a lot of animals, they learn to be efficient and not waste energy and to move well. I think that'd be one thing, but still, if you look back you look at primitive cultures versus us, American culture, because of our environment, they move better, the primitive people. But in all cultures, I think you still see that we need to train ourselves to use concepts right. I think that's a big issue, how someone connects concepts to experience and perception. And some people call that psychoepistemology. Not like psycho the way kids use it, like, you're psycho. I mean like psycho short for psychological. Mm-hmm. So like your own psychological epistemology, how a person on their own relates concepts and experience together. So another definition of education might be developing an optimal psychoepistemology in a student. And that's something that is volitional. We need training to do it from experts. And that is the fundamental reason, I think, for education. The fact that we need training in a lot of things, but without training from experts and reinforcement over years, we're not going to learn to think logically and rationally.
Well, that builds on that third goal I just mentioned, to prepare for a useful career, one appropriate to your status as a free man or woman in society. And that if you want to remain free, right, again, knowing the good from the truly good for you, it does take conceptual formation and deduction and studying multiple fields. And being free, creating value for other people does give you money. Money gives you options. And that's the goal, is to enjoy life, to have options, and to be free.
That's interesting. Yeah, it's like that shows how you can look at things from different perspectives. Because on the one hand, you're saying what I said builds on that, but I think metaphysically, from a different perspective, what you said builds on what I said, the metaphysics of man. So that's like fascinating how you can look at things in different ways and how the causal relationship can seem to change depending on the context.
And that it's so integrative. This, since the Middle Ages, was the classic training for leadership was a liberal arts degree. Mm-hmm. It wasn't that everybody was going to go be a poet or a painter. But it's all of that learning set in context of the greater culture that prepares you to be a leader. So yes, now with your master's degree, fine, specialize, go get something technical per your field. But the liberal arts degree was always about preparing for leadership.
Yeah. Having a broad context. So it's like helping you become wiser, because if you're going to be a leader, you need more wisdom. How does the world work? How do people work? What should we do? What's the good? Where should we go? Where should we go? It involves a broader context of knowledge. It involves more wisdom than just
and telling everybody to code, that's great, be a coder, fine. But if you look at the CEOs and so on, they're not doing more coding. Or the Steve Jobses, they're reading 17th century Japanese philosophy. They're reading a lot of these seemingly esoteric things. I'll give you an example. When I first started coaching water polo, I had played in college, but I didn't know much about how to coach it or even how to run formal offenses, etc. So I read the Book of Five Rings, which is a 17th century book on samurai sword fighting. And it was very philosophical, and there were certain principles there that I constructed a 2-3 page handout based on the sword fighting and how that applies to water polo. And those kind of became our conceptual things to hold in your head, that we're always doing these things, and thus we didn't have to worry about as much of the X's and O's until we learned that. And we got good very quickly because I pulled some book off my philosophy shelf.
Yeah, and that reminds me, talking about coding and poetry, actually, like, if people would study the short biographies of some scientists, they would learn so much and be so shocked. Like, what's his name? Richard Feynman, one of the great physicists of the 1900s.
Yes.
Won the Nobel Prize, was regarded as one of the great physics teachers of the 1900s. He was so well-rounded. People would think, well, he's a scientist and he's a physicist. He's so boring. What a nerd. Oh my gosh. That guy, he was, if you see the movie Infinity about him, there's some movie with the Avengers called Infinity Now, but if you look at Infinity about Richard Feynman, beautiful movie. And like the beginning has some very deep philosophical ideas told in a concrete form about him growing up, some important things about epistemology. I think we talked about before. I brought it up with Melanie's kids numerous times. Like, I think we said this in a previous podcast, but little Richard, when he's like 3 or 5, asks his dad, "What's the name of that bird?" And his dad says, I could tell you the name of that bird, and I could tell you the name in all these different languages, but then all you know is what it's called. He says, look at the bird, watch the bird, smell the area, like see what the bird does and how it moves and what it eats and where it goes. He didn't say all that, but you get the idea. It's about, so that's got a lot of epistemology wrapped up in it, but it's a good movie. I just wanted to bring that up, and that's one thing you get in it. But Feynman, when he was at Los Alamos to develop the atom bomb, and there's a story I read in some of the books he wrote. So some people come in, these like college physics people, and they're going to help him work on the project. And so he's showing them how to use some computer equipment. And Feynman is such a genius that he got the cards and cut them. So when he ran them through the computer for the kids, it played a song. So it's like, can you imagine? You run these cards through, the old cards from the 60s. You have these paper cards, and there's holes punched in them, and they get run through really quickly. And then that programs the computer to do the calculations. So people, that's the way it used to be before nowadays. Long time ago. That's what we built on. But he could run, like he knew exactly what holes to push. So when he ran the cards through, it play, imagine some cards, paper cards you're running through when you hear Mary had a little lamb, It's like, what a genius.
And he was tested in probably elementary, middle school on an IQ test and was scored only a 125, which 100 is average, so that's a decent IQ, but clearly that was not his correct IQ. The tests were very heavily verbal back then, and of course he was very much math.
And then creativity isn't really measured as much on those things, or persistence.
Right.
And then if you read some of the things he wrote, he was interested in a lot of aspects of the world. He actually did experiments on ants, wondering what they do to make their trail, if it's chemical or whatever. And I don't remember some of the other stuff, but just had his mind. And he could play instruments. He learned to play the bongo drums and some other musical instruments, He's not just some little timid nerd. Or the people who started the NASA program, you wouldn't want to have messed with them. They're not PhD physics nerds. They were fighter pilots, black belts in karate. I've read a book by, remember in like Apollo 13 or whatever, Krantz, I think Gene Krantz, wasn't he in charge?
I'm not sure.
I don't remember the guy's name. Was it Apollo 11 or Apollo 13 where they almost didn't make it back and they had to do the calculations? And the guy said failure is not an option.
Right.
You don't recall who that was, though?
No.
Okay. But them, again, you'd think they're like PhDs. They're just nerdy and boring. But like I say, there are some fighter pilots, black belts in martial arts. And in this book, they say they used to play volleyball. Yeah, it's okay. I just looked it up. Gene Krantz. The book is Failure is Not an Option. He was the flight director, Apollo 11 through Apollo 13. So it's him. But I think it's in here. He reports that they played volleyball, and the volleyball games were like, if I remember right, half karate, half volleyball.
Yeah.
They were very physical. It's like a hockey game, So people are more rich and developed than some of the like conventional ideas or whatever it might lead some people to think.
And I think that as a parent, just kind of looking back over the years of having these 3 kids, that I think we're all a lot safer if we have a good education, because, knowing that we're efficacious, we can actually take what a doctor tells us, or, somebody who's proposing some procedure or some method of, medication, and you can take your confidence that you can understand things and you can figure out stuff too. And you can figure out, is this the right thing for us? Is this the right avenue to take, medically speaking? So education really kind of can help you feel that confidence that you can understand what people, if you can't, you can always figure it out. You have a mind that's active, and
independence matters. And kind of to segue on that, like, if it's done right and you really learn logic and reasoning, you learn that every individual reasons or can, and people make mistakes, and just because someone's a doctor doesn't mean they're right. It makes you stop and think, okay, is my reasoning process right? It's not always right. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. I got to work to be that way. It's because I'm a human being. Doctors are human too. They are no different. So what is this doctor's MO, modus operandi? What is his cognitive MO? Is he logical or not? Is he authoritarian or not? Does he want to manipulate people, or does he want to help them focus on reality and figure out things themselves and work with them in that way? And Aristotle's relevant there, I think Aristotle is, so far as I know the philosophy, I don't think there's anybody before him, but Aristotle is the philosophical founder of that idea, because, let me know what you know, Scott, but Aristotle is the first one in history who I know of who identified that the evidence of the senses is a fundamental principle of epistemology. Plato didn't do that. Plato was a genius. He did a lot of things, but Aristotle identified that the evidence of the senses or experience was fundamental, and Galileo knew that. But if that's the case, then because every human has access to the world, then every human with a functioning reason can be self-sovereign. So I think sovereignty philosophically comes from Aristotle.
And that split is captured in Raphael's famous painting, The School of Athens. And anybody listening, you have seen that painting, whether you know you have or not, but just Google it.
Yeah.
And in the center is Plato and Aristotle walking. And Aristotle has a book, and his other hand is pointing toward the ground. And he's talking about objective reality perceived through the 5 senses. And from that, building epistemology and reason, whereas Plato is pointing up to the sky, and he's talking about his idea of the forms, that the ideal version of things, beauty, justice, etc., exist out in the universe, but we'll never know them on this earth. And so they definitely had a philosophical disagreement about that.
And it's interesting that Aristotle was so in love with biology, whereas from indications I've seen, most people in Plato's Academy were in love with the stars and had to be kind of convinced or persuaded to pay any attention to biology at all.
Yeah, and math, that was the phrase inscribed above Plato's door of the Academy was let none who do not love geometry enter here. Mm-hmm. And yeah, Aristotle pretty much invented the field of biology, created taxonomy.
Yeah. Yeah, and we'll have to put in the show notes a link to a very good, maybe BBC documentary. I forgot who the professor was, PhD in a biological field. He wrote the book The Lagoon. And I think it was the BBC made a documentary about that. It's about an hour long, but this guy is discussing how he came upon Aristotle's works in biology. And I think at first, if I remember right, at one point in life, he didn't pay attention, but then one day he saw them at a bookstore and started looking and just fell in love. It's a really good documentary. The guy's got a really good, passionate opening, really praising Aristotle. It's Armand Marie Leroy, Leroi, however you pronounce that in French or English. It's a book, and there was a documentary made on it. And Armand, learned some things from some more recent Aristotelian philosophers of science who are looking at Aristotle's biology, like Dr. Gotthelf. Unfortunately, he's passed away, but this Leroy, sorry if I'm butchering the name, but he learned a bit from Dr. James Lennox, who was at the University of Pittsburgh, Aristotelian philosopher. He had a big role in the documentary, I think. Kind of implicitly by teaching Leroi. But so yeah, it's interesting their interests. And I don't know to what extent that affected their philosophy, but of course philosophy is in general, so it's a little distinct from that. But Plato was also one who thought about philosopher kings and they should lead. Aristotle made mistakes too, like every human being. I make mistakes. Every person on earth nowadays makes mistakes. No one's perfect. And we're limited by our time to some extent, and so was Aristotle. So I think we got to, some of the mistakes he made about women and slavery, you got to put it in context. I think it's like Galileo said. Galileo was fighting the scholastics, and they said, but Aristotle said that the sun goes around the earth, so it does. And Galileo said, he said something like, to paraphrase, in following and obeying the evidence of the senses, I think I contradict Aristotle less by saying the earth goes around the sun than do those who, ignoring experience, say the sun goes around the earth. Because Aristotle knew explicitly, and he identified it explicitly, that the evidence of the senses was fundamental in Aristotle. He had a certain method and certain basic premises. So I think if Aristotle lived nowadays, because of his methodology, his modus operandi, I think he'd have different opinions about some of that slavery and men and women and so on.
Sure. Yeah, and Aristotle thought that the stars were lodged in concentric crystal spheres that rotated around the Earth,
Yeah.
and that's the church built on that with the scholastic scholars, that the great chain of being, the different levels of heaven. So when you say the Earth moves, you're shattering all those crystal spheres, and so it was a bigger deal than just how it's often taught in class.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot to it, a lot of integration and so on. So I think my cat, who's in the room, once out. So y'all two talk for a second. Let me let my cat out. G'day.
So maybe just from a homeschool question here, Scott. What would you say? You know, it's tricky because when you have three kids that all have independent interests in things, and you're kind of trying to help them discover their talents and their potential, and kind of chase their excitement and their passions when they have them. But what do you think are some of the most valuable subjects that a person could make sure their child is really studying and grasping, and you know, like there's just no room for debate. You really need to learn this and study this. Sure, writing your own movies or playing the piano for 4 hours a day and you're 14, that's all great, but you got, so what do you, where do you go?
Oh, that each question you ask just gets broader than the last one. And to even answer it is to say the other subjects don't matter as much. Let me start first with two skills, and then I would pick a subject or two. Being able to write is so important because writing really refines the thinking. And people think they can think until they try to write. Mm-hmm. And you find out very quickly whether or not you can really think. So you've got to put it down on paper. That's how you really rearrange how you think. And so learning to write well, kids, of course, then, well, how do I do that? And the easiest way is to read a lot. When you read a lot, you come across good writers, you come across great writers, and I've just learned so much from certain great books. And you sometimes forget you're reading the book because you keep going back and looking at their command of the language and how they crafted a sentence. And that starts to refine your own thinking and how you write. So that's the main skill I think we should get out of school. That also then creates that command of language for you. And so when you go to speak and convey ideas to other people, that all goes back to the writing, I think. Mm-hmm. So go ahead. As far as subjects, I'm a history philosophy guy. I obviously think those are important. History, in addition to being the grand record of what has happened, is also that vast early warning system so that you can see bad ideas coming. I mean, we don't, but you can see them coming if you study history enough. So I like that. I do. I would love to have philosophy be a required course at every school because, from metaphysics, certainly epistemology, ethics, some training in political philosophy, and aesthetics, the study of art and beauty. I think that's a nice, it's kind of like the mortar in between the bricks that are these other subjects. And that's what kids often don't see the connection, because the subjects are often presented isolated in their little silos. Mm-hmm. And I think we need to break down the silos and integrate things.
Yeah. Yeah, it's one thing that's changed my teaching is getting the concept of integration and taking it more seriously. I think some people out in the culture know integration, but they don't really utilize it in education as they should. They still compartmentalize their subjects too much. But once I got that concept of integration and started to develop it more in my own thinking, made a much bigger difference in appreciating things and knowing them in my own mind and understanding, and then being able to teach people other things like that. And then I think it's important to teach and bring it up a lot because integration is not a skill that develops automatically. A lot of people, they can learn math and they can learn some complicated math, but they still cannot integrate where it matters. I think integration is something you got to start teaching people to do on a small scale when they're younger and then build up. Like some people call that thinking in principle. And I'll do that when it's appropriate when I'm tutoring and teaching. Sometimes you got to focus on a test. It wouldn't be appropriate. The kid needs to get a good grade, whatever. But sometimes when you're freer, I can talk about note taking and say, like, we need to take good notes. That's one reason that's holding you back. Taking good notes, there's certain things you need to do, like don't write a bunch of stuff down. You need to organize it. And so you need to use space as much as you use stuff. And then you can point out that that's what musicians do. Like, partly I got that idea from Yo-Yo Ma, the great cellist. He said, a great musician does not care only about the notes he makes. He crafts and sculpts what's in between the notes as well. Or a great architect like Frank Lloyd, like a poor architect thinks the buildings and the walls are what matter. But a great architect like Frank Lloyd Wright, who gets the bigger picture and who's integrated architecture to human life and survival and the local surroundings, he gets that the space is what matter and the walls are just to support the space and separate the rooms. So same thing with taking notes. You got similar things there. It's like the space matters as much as the stuff there. You know, and that's like in, that idea comes up in good advertising. Like some people aren't good at advertising and it's just a bunch of words all over the place and you just don't want to look at it. But like, what does a company like Apple do? It's sparse and clean and crisp and concise, right?
And that's why interior designers don't refer to it as a room. They always say this space.
Yeah.
And there can be multiple, which is irritating at first, but then when you understand what they're talking about, there are often multiple spaces within a room. There's the area in front of the TV, there's a sitting area, and how do you design those spaces?
Yeah, good point. And then there's other examples of thinking in principle that have come up through this episode, and that shows that we walk the walk and talk the talk, you know, because we're not just saying education should be this or that. If you go back and listen to our other conversations with Scott, we're giving examples. We don't just give some like airy-fairy abstraction and not back it up. Our abstractions come from concrete things, so we always, you know, within the limits of time and everything, and the ability of the human mind to process in like an hour, we always give examples. We're integrating, we've connected this, just like a good interior designer doesn't just know the interior, she needs to know something about color, art, aesthetics, different aesthetics according to the client, survival, human values, human life, why we have houses, how their home relates to other things in life, know a little bit about botany for flowers and all that. A lot of integration. So, and some things about psychology, measurement. So all the different things that we've been talking about, like Scott said, there's different subjects that we need to learn when we're younger, and that's a good example he brought up right there of how all this stuff comes up in interior design.
Mm-hmm. And I should kind of mention too, the kids are taking a great combination of classes with Scott Powell and Luke Travers. Scott Powell's course is called History at Our House. It's an online history course. And every year they study a new topic. This year's world history with an emphasis in Asia and Africa. And last year it was American history, and then prior to that was European history. So Luke Travers ties in with that, in that he's selecting literature that would have been written during those time periods, or at least from that location. So the kids are getting literature, discussing and exploring those regions, and then Scott Powell is giving them the history of that area to give it some context. And I think it's kind of contextual both ways. It's not like one provides context for the other. They really do work and integrate well together. So it's very neat seeing them having more, like you were talking about, historical, philosophical a little bit too. And then they have to do writing as well. So the three things you listed, Scott, to get kids really going on their education and being well-rounded, it's amazing how they can get that out of those two. So I wish we lived closer to you guys so we could get into your classes as well. Not much I can do about that.
And I agree, as we've talked about before, Scott. Yeah, writing is very important. It's a skill that should occur in all areas of education, as we've talked about. I don't remember in conversations with Scott, but Melanie and I have talked about using essays to help her children in science class. I require essays.
Yeah, you do.
We write them and rewrite, and that helps you think better when you don't just write it once, but when you go through a draft and then a second with feedback and then a third with feedback and then a fourth with feedback. That's how you really learn to write and think and reason and be logical. And some things that, like, some people might ask, well, how does it help you think and be logical? Well, some things are making sure you have, as we talked about before with concepts, make sure you have an example of an idea. So are there examples, when appropriate, in the essay? Is there a logical sequence of thought, is in like a geometric proof? And by the way, since we're talking about Aristotle, from what I've heard, so this shows the importance of Aristotle and integration. Aristotle discovered and developed logic by seeing how geometric proof was done, from what I've read. He saw people did geometric proof, and they always had to have a starting point. You couldn't start out of nowhere. There had to be some agreed rules, and then you worked through some steps, and then got a conclusion. And from what I've heard, he was the only one. He was the genius who could see that, whoa, that's not just in geometric proof. That's the basic structure of all rational thought. You start from experience, and then you reason from there. So he got the structure and nature of reason from seeing how geometric proof was done. And so he integrated geometry into epistemology. That's beautiful.
Nice.
Yeah. But so in writing, is there a progression of thought? Are there examples? And then depending on the level the student's at, you can see, can the student find, if you're writing about a book, can the student find outside sources that are relevant? What connections can they make to another field other than what the book discusses? What else can you think of, Scott, about concepts and reasoning that could be illustrated in, or shown, developed in an essay?
Well, I tell you, that sounds like a whole separate podcast.
Okay, we'll wait.
Absolutely, I have a lot to say about that, and I don't even want to start.
Yeah, okay, we won't start. Another podcast someday, folks. Okay, so let me see. So it's almost an hour and a half. We don't want to have this too long for everybody. There's enough to digest as it is, but we got into why we need an education and talked about the subjects. Maybe we can talk about the subjects a little more, but I want to throw in addition to what has been mentioned so far, we also need the physical sciences and mathematics. Mathematics comes up in physics and chemistry and finance and economics, and as we discussed, studying geometry helps you learn thinking skills you need in law, and helps you learn about sequences of thought, and it helps you get some evidence that Aristotle had to learn about epistemology. So, and that's one thing we want to do in education is get stuff that's universal, stuff that some detailed concrete things, but we want things that apply to all areas of life, adult life as a human being, and math is one of those things. I think history is important because we're social animals and we need to know where we come from, why things are the way they are, and where we can go with that, and how people have made changes in the past. And then, okay, so I have a degree in math and a degree in philosophy, but over the past few years, I've finally figured out that biology is a fundamental. I think biology needs to be taught a lot more in school. And if I had to punt and get rid of some things, I'd get rid of physics and chemistry way before I got rid of biology. And besides, those things can be taught through biology in a more interesting way. And then I think that one thing students are looking for and they know is relevant when they say in math or physics, when are we ever going to use this? They're saying, what is its survival value? How does this help me live? What's the biological value of this? And so I think they're getting at the importance of biology there. And as Melanie and I talked about in a podcast with Kim Cabrera, some people think that tracking was the origin of modern science because of the thinking skills involved in it. Very detailed, concrete. It takes long-range planning and thinking. You got to think in an integrated fashion, ecologically. Like, what is the animal? What is it going to do? How does it behave? Where does it get water? Where does it eat? Right? So, for a lot of different reasons, I think biology should be stressed a lot more than it is. It should be more fundamental. You want to disagree, Scott? Or do you have to agree again?
No.
Damn! I was hoping we could have a little disagreement somewhere.
Well, you could make a case for any of these courses, and that's why you need to take them all, children. You need a well-rounded education.
Truth to power, man. Truth to power. All right, so very good discussion, very deep. Lot for people to think about. That's an episode that some people I'd recommend listening to over a few times. I got a degree in philosophy. I've thought about and done this stuff for years. And so I've already gone through the pain and suffering and the joys of learning and being curious to get here after many, many decades on this earth. So hopefully we can make some people's journeys a lot shorter and less painful. So, we talked about, as we said, why we need an education, why human beings need an education, and basically what subjects should be taught. And I think we were doing that while we were talking about why it's important as well. Do y'all want to summarize any of those points, like in your own words or anything?
Well, certainly students can follow their passion. When you like a subject, it's easier to stay motivated, but don't be afraid to pursue some of those rabbit trails that go off into other subjects, because that's when it gets interesting.
Mm-hmm.
My bookshelf by my reading chair has books on biology, Robert Sapolsky at Stanford. I've got books on philosophy. I've got some books from the 1930s. I've got all kinds of stuff, and I love just reading in different areas.
Yeah, there's no way in heck I would be where I am unless I read all I did. Philosophy, history, physics, chemistry, the history of physics, the philosophy of physics, the history of chemistry, the philosophy of chemistry, biology, the history of biology, Aristotle, education, Montessori, you know, read, read, read.
But did you practice an instrument?
I'm too uncoordinated for that.
It's a different way of thinking. It's a different style of reading, let me tell you.
Yeah, I'll bet.
Participating in the reading, yeah.
True.
Thanks so much, Scott.
Oh, but
thanks for having me.
I bang on trees sometimes. Does that count?
Hey, sometimes you just, as a drum, that works.
Yeah, thank you, Scott. Sorry.
Yeah, look forward to talking again. Wow, just scratching surfaces here.
We'll talk about writing next time.
Yeah, thank you so much for answering those questions. I know they're, like you said, pretty broad, but you sure find a way to essentialize and get them right to the crux. So that's great. Thank you so much. You're very good.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for taking the time, Scott. We appreciate it.
Yeah, appreciate that. All right, well, have a good evening.
All right,
you too.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so hope everyone enjoys that. If you have any questions, just let us know. And again, if anybody, a teacher, wants some training for themselves or a school, you can contact Scott, Melanie, and myself, or all three of us, or two of us individually, or whatever. Or if you're a professional, you or your company want some training and thinking skills, you can contact us. We'd be glad to help. And if you have any questions, just shoot us something in the comments or an email. We'd appreciate it. And if you could like the podcast and pass it on to other people, we'd appreciate it. That'd help our culture out a lot. Help people think better, live better. It's better all around. Anything else, guys?
That's it.
Okay. Thank y'all for listening, folks, and we'll talk to y'all soon. Bye.